What's up, guys? It's Crayfish Obsession here, and today we're going to be talking about crayfish fighting. So we're going to be going over how crayfish fight, why crayfish fight, and kind of the different methods they use between crayfish species and how they might differ, and all that kind of cool stuff, and also crayfish behavior when they fight. What are they like when they fight other crayfish, and what are they like when they fight off predators or when they wrestle prey. Now, let's start with crayfish one-on-one fighting. Now, when crayfish live together in a stream, which is almost any natural habitat crayfish live together, there is a social hierarchy. And I have a complete video on crayfish social hierarchy, totally explained. I'll put a link into the description and maybe a box on the screen if I figure out how to do it. But basically, there's a dominant crayfish, and they kind of go on a power tree by fighting each other. And this is how they know who's dominant, who's the healthiest, and who gets the best territory. Now, this can be male or female. Crayfish don't really care about the sex of crayfish. The male and females are basically really similar, so it's not like a lot of other invertebrates where the female is just a lot more dominant. This is not true in crayfish. But let's get into the real interesting stuff when it comes to crayfish fighting. So how do they even fight each other in the first place? What's going on? What's really going on when you see two crayfish fighting? And a lot of people would be like, oh, well, they're just trying to claw each other to death. But there's actually a lot more to it, and it gets a lot more interesting once you really understand what's going on, and you can kind of understand fights as you watch them. Now, I don't recommend you go and start a crayfish fighting ring, but if you ever do see one in the wild or in an aquarium store or something like that, you can really understand what's going on and kind of piece together how the fight is working. Now, when crayfish really come to square up against each other, a lot of the times, most fights are ended before they even start. There's obviously a dominant crayfish, and then there's a less dominant crayfish, and the dominant crayfish is going to just instantly scare off the smaller crayfish. And you might ask how dominance is portrayed, and dominance is portrayed purely by claw size. Studies show that crayfish with bigger claws win more fights. And pro tip for mating, you don't have to judge them by body size. Claw size also works. So basically, if a crayfish has bigger claws and shows it well, the crayfish with smaller claws are going to just back off and not even enter the fight. And studies even show that crayfish with bigger claws actually win more fights. So it's not just bluffing. If you force a crayfish with bigger claws to fight with a crayfish with smaller claws, the crayfish with bigger claws will always win. Now, this kind of adds onto male and female. Males usually have bigger claws in proportion to their bodies. So males are going to more commonly win more fights. Now, when real deadly fights happen, it's when there are two similarly matched crayfish with similar size of the claw. This is when fights really get intense because the crayfish cannot tell who's better, and therefore if they don't know who's going to win the fight, they're going to have to actually draw it out. Now, a lot of people might think that when crayfish start to square up, they put their hands up in the waving fashion that people see when crayfish are trying to defend themselves. But based on my experience, this usually doesn't happen. Crayfish only do that as a defensive pose to scare away bigger predators. When they kind of come into contact with each other, their antennas touch each other, and their claws start to open up. When their claws start to open up, and both sides are opening up claws, and they might not go all the way up like a Y, but their claws will be in an elevated, more ready to pounce position, and usually that's when the fight starts. Now, when crayfish are in the act of fighting, they're not trying to kill the enemy necessarily. Their first objective is to remove the claws of the enemy. So that's why when you see crayfish, they're always poking each other's claws. This is not in a defensive pose. A lot of people think that when crayfish are kind of clawing it out with each other's claws, their one is kind of swinging and the other is defending with its claws. This is rarely the case. What's actually happening is the crayfish they're trying to get in to the other opponent's inner arm, and that way they can manage to, if they manage to get a good grip onto that inner arm, or inner first walking leg, which is the claw, they can squeeze hard and that claw will come right off. And they literally disarm the enemy. And this is also really helpful for knowing how a crayfish got injuries, for example. Where shell rot happens, a lot of the time shell rot will happen inside that inner arm of the claw because that crayfish has been fighting a lot, therefore the shell is going to get breached more. They are rarely going to go for the head or any other kind of organ, and that's because crayfish are pretty good, well designed by nature. Their shell is extremely hard to pinch, only a couple of times, and it would have to be a large crayfish with large claws. I've seen one crush a juvenile before, but that was on one time, and that was in a matchup where in a natural circumstance the juvenile would have just instantly bolted and fled with the tail flick. So in the wild, they're not really going to go for the head or anything of the sort, and they're not going to go for the legs. That's too small of a target, and a crayfish can drop legs whenever they need to. Now, a lot of the times in fights, a crayfish will try to bolt. More often or not, the losing crayfish will try to bolt out of the fight, but crayfish are extremely aggressive, and that bolt isn't usually a sign of backing down. If a crayfish has already entered a fight, it's rarely going to back down from it anytime early in the fight. So I'm not saying crayfish are going to fight to the death, but they often do. But once they kind of get into the fight, they're really into it. And if they bolt, it's just to get some space between them and their opponent and try to get some better luck next time as they go into the other crayfish. And also, a really cool thing that crayfish do is they like to piss, or they like to urinate when they start to fight. Now, this is a lot more interesting than it sounds. So basically, if a crayfish urinates, the chemicals inside the urine, the other crayfish can pick up, and this is a chemical signal that any other crayfish can pick up with their antenna. And what's really interesting about it is when a crayfish urinates, it basically tells other crayfish their condition. It tells other crayfish how long it's been since they last molted, so how hard their shell is. It tells them how healthy they are. It tells other crayfish how old they are, etc. like that. It tells them the sex they are, if they're male or female. And basically, the urine is an ID. And when a crayfish urinates in a fight, that means that this crayfish is confident enough to show other people its true identity in a way. And kind of like people, if that crayfish isn't really healthy, or it's recently molted, or it's just not really doing well, it's not going to urinate. Because if it urinates near another crayfish, all other crayfish are going to sense it, are going to realize that this is a weak crayfish, and they're going to go and fight it, and they're going to go and beat it. So only a strong, healthy crayfish will really utilize that urine and pretty much scare or bluff away its enemies. And I thought that was really interesting when I read the research on that. Now, how do crayfish fight when combating other fish, bigger predators, and even humans? And you guys probably know how this works. The crayfish gets up, does a little Y pose, tries to get really big, and has its tail out, and its tail is very spread out. And this way, as you can guess, it makes the crayfish seem a lot bigger to a lot of fish and its predators. Also, taking a perspective from a crayfish, the fact that the crayfish is at the bottom of a lake or is at the bottom of a creek, its arms pointing straight up is not just purely a defense pose. It's actually the most efficient pose it can be in if a predator is attacking it, because 99 times out of 100, the predator is going to be coming from above. So having its claws up top is actually going to let it grab or take hold or pinch any of its enemies or any of its predators that would try to eat it. Also, having the tail flipped out allows it to instantly bolt if it needs to, and this is what a crayfish will usually do in its natural habitat. The fish will come close, and then the crayfish will just bolt, or the crayfish will just instantly bolt, usually. But if a crayfish is put into the situation where it must fight off a fish, or even invasive crayfish are there to fight off a fish. Because a lot of the times, invasive crayfish are really aggressive, and a lot of the native fish just aren't used to having such aggressive prey, or prey that fights back. So usually a crayfish will just grab a good hold on the fish's mouth, something like that, and kind of just pinch really hard and let go. And crayfish are pretty smart when they pinch. The moment you start to bring a crayfish that's pinching up, it usually lets go. The moment it realizes that it's being pulled up, it lets go instantly, and that way it hits the ground. And this is not just because you're picking it up or it's pinching you and it doesn't want to get out of the water. It's because if it pinches onto a fish, or if it latches onto a fish and the fish starts to swim up, it's really bad for the crayfish, because that means the higher the fish goes up, the more the crayfish has to float down, and the more time the crayfish spends floating down, the bigger a target it is. So a lot of the things that people think that crayfish do just because we're people and it's on land, a lot of this stuff is just replicated underwater, and what they do above land is just what they do underwater. And I think this is really eye-opening once you kind of get into this stuff. But yeah, so that was my kind of crayfish fighting video. One of you guys requested it, so I made one, and I really enjoyed making that video. I'm about to get a crayfish pair of Cherax, so you guys should stay tuned for that. And yeah, so this is Crayfish Obsession, and I'll see you in the next one.